There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the ocean just before dawn. The water is black and perfectly still. The horizon has not yet decided whether it belongs to the night or the day, and somewhere out there, moving through that silence without a sound, is a ship. Whether that ship carries a criminal or a servant of the crown, that, as it turns out, is a far more complicated question than it might first appear. Welcome. This is a documentary about two of history's most misunderstood figures who have been flattened by legend, romanticized by cinema, simplified by costume stores and theme parks, until what remains bears almost no resemblance to the complex, dangerous, and deeply political reality of the people they were. We are talking, of course, about pirates and about privateers. Most people, if asked, would say they are more or less the same thing. Men on ships, stolen treasure, a flag with a skull on it, and in the broadest, most surface-level sense, there is a kind of logic to that assumption. Both operated at sea. Both were willing to take what did not belong to them. Both lived lives that the average person on land would have considered either deeply thrilling or deeply terrifying, depending on which end of the cannon they happened to be standing. But look closer. Look just a little closer, and the differences begin to emerge. Not as footnotes, not as technicalities, but as the very foundations upon which two entirely different worlds were built. A pirate answered to no one. That was, in many ways, the entire point. To step outside the reach of kings and governments, to declare yourself ungoverned and ungovernable, was an act of profound defiance, in an age when defiance of that kind came with a price measured in rope and gallows. Pirates were outlaws in the most literal sense of the word, outside the law, beyond it, existing in the margins of a world that had decided it had no place for them. A privateer, on the other hand, carried a piece of paper. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider following our show as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. It was called A Letter of Marque, and that piece of paper, that single document stamped with a royal seal, signed by a government official, was the difference between a man who would be celebrated upon returning to port and a man who would be hanged. It was the difference between a legal profession and a capital crime. It was, in the language of the era, the difference between a sanctioned instrument of war and an enemy of all mankind. Hostis humani generis. That was the Latin phrase applied to pirates in legal doctrine, stretching back to ancient Rome. Enemy of all humanity, not of one nation, not of one kingdom, but of the entire human race. It is a remarkable designation, and it tells you everything about how seriously the world took that line, the one drawn between a privateer and a pirate, even when that line was, at times, dangerously thin. Over the course of this documentary, we are going to explore 7 of the most important differences between these two figures. We will move slowly and deliberately through each one, because these are not simple distinctions. They are windows into the political machinery of empire, the economics of maritime trade, the nature of loyalty, the meaning of law, and the extraordinary circumstances that could turn a celebrated hero of one nation into a condemned criminal overnight. We will look at the documents that separated them, at the flags they flew, at the courts that judged them, at the fates that awaited them when their sailing days were done. We will meet some of the men, and yes, occasionally some of the women, who walked this line. Some fell to one side, some fell to the other, and some, in ways that history has found endlessly fascinating, managed to walk it for years before the rope finally caught up with them. You do not need to be a historian to follow this story. You need only be willing to slow down, to let the world of sails and salt water and 17th century politics wash over you at its own pace. History, when it is told properly, is never a rush. It is a tide. It comes in gradually, and before you know it, you are standing in something much deeper than you expected. So settle in. The ocean is patient. The story has been waiting centuries, and we are only just beginning. It is easy, from where we stand today, to underestimate the power of a document. We live in an age of paperwork. Forms and signatures and digital confirmations arrive in such volume, so relentlessly, that they have lost almost all of their weight. We click agree without reading. We sign without pausing. We have forgotten, in the noise of modern bureaucracy, that there was a time when a single piece of paper could be the most important object a human being owned, that it could be the difference between freedom and a prison cell, between a hero's welcome and a public execution. In the age of sail, that document was called a letter of marque. And if you want to understand the difference between a privateer and a pirate, truly understand it, down to the bone, this is where you must begin. The full name, in the formal language of the era, was a letter of marque and reprisal. The phrase itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Marque comes from an old French word meaning frontier or boundary. The idea being that a sovereign was granting someone permission to cross a boundary that would otherwise be forbidden. Reprisal referred to the legal concept of taking something back, of seizing goods or vessels in retaliation for wrongs done to one's nation or its merchants. Put them together, and you have something quite precise. Not a general license for chaos, not an invitation to sail wherever you wished and take whatever you wanted. A letter of marque was a targeted, conditional, carefully worded commission from a sovereign government authorizing a private captain to attack and seize the ships and cargo of a specific enemy nation, and only that nation, during a time of declared conflict or demonstrated grievance. Every word in that sentence matters. Authorized. The privateer did not act on personal impulse. He acted because a government had decided his actions served a national purpose and had put that decision in writing. Private captain. The privateer was not a member of the regular navy. He was a civilian. He owned his own ship, funded his own crew, bore his own costs and risks. The letter of marque was, in this sense, a kind of contract between a government and an entrepreneur. The government providing legal cover, the privateer providing muscle, and both expecting to profit from the arrangement. Specific enemy nation. This is perhaps the most important constraint of all. A privateer operating under a letter of marque was not free to attack any vessel that crossed his path. He was bound, legally and explicitly, to target only the ships of the nation or nations named in his commission. To attack a neutral vessel, or worse, a ship belonging to his own nation or an ally, was not merely a violation of the letter's terms. It was an act that could, and frequently did, result in the privateer's commission being revoked and his status instantly reclassified from lawful combatant to common pirate. The paper was everything. Without it, you were nothing but a criminal at sea. Governments granted these letters for reasons that were, at their core, entirely practical. Maintaining a standing navy was expensive, enormously, ruinously expensive. Ships required constant maintenance, sailors required pay, admirals required prestige and the budgets to support it. For smaller nations, or for major powers, engaged in prolonged multi-theater conflicts that stretched their naval resources thin, the privateer system offered a solution that was, from a certain angle, almost elegant. Why build another warship when a willing captain with his own vessel will do the work for you? Why pay crew out of the royal treasury when those sailors will accept a share of whatever prizes they capture? The privateer absorbed the cost and the risk. The government absorbed the political benefit. And in return for taking on that cost and risk, the privateer received something that could not be bought at any price on the open market: legitimacy. England understood this calculus. perhaps better than any other nation, during the long wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, against Spain in particular. The letter of marque became almost a tool of foreign policy. English privateers did not merely harass Spanish shipping. They disrupted trade routes. They seized treasure fleets. They inserted themselves into the arteries of an empire and slowed the flow of wealth that kept it alive. All of it legal. All of it sanctioned. All of it happening with the quiet approval of a government that could, if pressed by a foreign ambassador, point to its own clean hands and suggest that these were merely the independent actions of private citizens. It was, in the most diplomatic sense of the phrase, plausible deniability at 20 knots. The process of obtaining a letter of marque varied by nation and era, but the essential structure was consistent. A captain, typically one with some reputation at sea, some demonstrated ability to command men and navigate difficult waters, would petition a government official, often an admiralty court or a colonial governor, for a commission. He would provide information about his vessel, its size, its armament, its crew complement. He would often be required to post a bond, a sum of money held as surety against misconduct, forfeited if he violated the terms of his commission, and he would identify, or the government would identify for him, the specific targets his commission authorized him to pursue. If the commission was granted, the captain received his letter. He kept it aboard his vessel at all times. It was, in effect, his identity, his proof of purpose. If he captured an enemy prize and brought it into port, that letter was what entitled him to have the capture adjudicated in an admiralty court, where a judge would rule on whether the seizure was lawful and award him his share of the proceeds. If he was captured by the enemy, that letter was, in theory at least, what entitled him to treatment as a prisoner of war rather than a criminal subject to immediate execution. In theory, the realities of war at sea were often considerably less orderly than the paperwork suggested. There is something quietly remarkable about the whole system when you step back and consider it from a distance. Here were governments essentially farming out acts of war to private contractors. Here were men risking their lives and their ships in conflicts they had not started, for nations that would disavow them the moment it became politically convenient to do so. Here was a legal framework built around the recognition that human greed, properly channeled and officially endorsed, could be made to serve state power. And it worked. For well over 2 centuries, it worked remarkably well. Privateers operating under letters of marque altered the outcomes of wars. They bankrupted merchant fleets. They made certain shipping lanes so dangerous that the cost of doing business on the ocean shifted in ways that reshaped economies and, by extension, the map of empire itself, all because of a piece of paper. A pirate had no such paper, and this is where the distinction becomes not merely legal, but almost philosophical. The pirate had looked at this entire system, the bonds, the commissions, the admiralty courts, the careful distinctions between permissible and impermissible targets, and had rejected it entirely, not failed to obtain access to it. Rejected it. The absence of the letter of marque was not, for most pirates, an administrative oversight. It was a choice. It was a declaration that no government had the authority to define the terms of one's existence on the water, that the ocean was beyond the reach of kings, that a free man on a free ship owed allegiance to no crown and no court. It was a radical idea. It was also, from the perspective of every government on earth, an absolutely intolerable one. The letter, then, was more than a legal document. It was a philosophical dividing line. On one side, a man the state could use. On the other, a man the state needed to destroy. How that destruction was carried out, and how often it failed, is a story for another segment. For now, let the weight of that single document settle. Let it sit. A piece of parchment. a wax seal, a signature from someone with the authority to grant it. In the age of sail, that was the distance between a patriot and a pirate. Before a single cannon was fired, before a boarding party had thrown its hooks across the rail of a prize vessel, before any blood had been drawn or any cargo touched, there was a moment, a single, suspended moment. It came when the ship on the horizon raised its flag. In the age of sail, that moment was everything. What went up the mast in those few seconds determined what happened next. Whether a merchant captain reached for his log or his pistol, whether his crew began to pray or to fight, whether the encounter ahead would end in surrender, in negotiation, or in violence. The flag was not decoration. It was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was communication. It was threat. It was, in the hands of someone who understood how to use it, one of the most powerful psychological instruments on the water. And privateers and pirates, though they sometimes flew the same colors, understood that instrument in profoundly different ways. Let us begin with the privateer, because his relationship to flags was, on the surface, the simpler of the two. A privateer operated under the authority of a sovereign nation, and so he flew that nation's colors. The English privateer flew the English flag. The French privateer flew the French. This was not merely custom. It was a legal obligation bound up in the terms of his letter of marque. To fly false colors as a privateer, to deceive a vessel into believing you were something you were not, and then attack under that deception, was a violation of the laws of war that could, again, in theory, strip him of his commission and expose him to prosecution. But here is where things begin to get interesting, because maritime law in this era allowed for a practice that sounds, to modern ears, almost like sanctioned deception. A privateer, and indeed any warship, was permitted to fly false colors during the approach to an enemy vessel. He could raise a neutral flag, or even the enemy's own flag, to get close without triggering alarm. The rule, such as it was, required only that he raise his true colors before the first shot was fired. Before the first shot. You will appreciate, perhaps, how thin that line was in practice, how much space existed between the letter of that rule and the chaotic, smoke-filled, shouting reality of an engagement at sea. The flag was a tool of theater, and the privateer was permitted to be an actor right up until the moment the cannons spoke. The pirate's relationship with flags was something else entirely, something more deliberate, more calculated, and, in the way that history tends to reserve its most fascinating details for the things we think we already understand, considerably more nuanced than the simple skull and crossbones image that has followed piracy into popular culture like a persistent shadow. The flag we know as the Jolly Roger, that grinning skull, those crossed bones on a field of black, did not emerge fully formed from the beginning of piracy. It evolved. It was refined. And its purpose, when you examine it closely, was not simply to terrify. It was to communicate a very specific message, calibrated with something approaching strategic precision. The black flag, in the early 18th century, was the opening offer. When a pirate vessel raised a black flag, it was saying something remarkably specific to the merchant ship in its sights. Surrender now, and you will not be harmed. That was the implicit promise carried in the black. No unnecessary violence, no destruction of cargo that everyone hoped to profit from. A clean transaction, your goods, your ship if we want it, and your lives in exchange for your cooperation. It sounds almost reasonable. And that, precisely, was the point. Pirates were not, as a rule, eager for prolonged fights. Prolonged fights damaged ships, their own ships as much as their targets. Prolonged fights killed crew members who were difficult to replace in the middle of the ocean. Prolonged fights risked destroying the cargo that made the entire enterprise worthwhile. A merchant captain who struck his colors at the sight of the black flag was, from the pirate's perspective, the ideal outcome. Business concluded. Everyone goes home. The red flag was a different conversation entirely. If the black flag was an offer, the red flag was its withdrawal. When a pirate crew ran up a red flag, and here the historical record is admirably consistent, it meant that the offer of mercy had expired. It meant that the target had resisted, or fled, or in some way demonstrated that the clean transaction was no longer available. The red flag meant no quarter would be given. It meant the calculation had shifted from commerce to something considerably darker. Most merchant captains, upon seeing the black flag, chose not to test what came after it. Individual pirate captains added their own layers to this visual language, and this is where the famous designs begin to appear in the historical record. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age, flew multiple flags depending on his mood and his target. One design showing a figure standing triumphantly on two skulls, representing his contempt for the governors of Barbados and Martinique, who had made his life difficult. Edward Lowe flew a red skeleton on black. Emmanuel Wynne is credited by some historians with one of the earliest recorded uses of the skull and crossbones configuration. Each design was personal. Each was, in its own way, a kind of signature. These were men who understood, with something approaching artistic instinct, that their flag was part of their reputation, and their reputation was part of their power. A pirate whose name and flag were widely known and widely feared could accomplish with psychology what would otherwise require gunpowder. Ships that recognized the colors sometimes surrendered before the vessel had even come within cannon range. Fear, properly cultivated, was extraordinarily efficient. The privateer's flag carried authority borrowed from a nation. The pirate's flag carried authority generated entirely by the man who flew it, by his history, his reputation, the stories that preceded him into every port and across every sea lane. One flag said, "Behind me stands a government." The other said, "Behind me stands nothing but my own willingness to do what others will not." Both, in their respective ways, worked. But only one of them could be lowered at the end of the voyage, folded away, and replaced with the quiet respectability of a man who had served his sovereign faithfully on the water. The other flew until there was no longer anyone left alive to fly it. There is a particular kind of theater that only the law can produce. Not the theater of the stage, with its painted backdrops and rehearsed lines. Something older than that. Something that operates according to its own rituals, its own costumes, its own careful choreography of power and submission. A courtroom in the 18th century was a place where society looked at itself in the mirror and decided, formally and out loud, what it was willing to tolerate and what it was not, where the line between acceptable and unacceptable was drawn in ink, and then, when the proceedings were concluded, sometimes drawn again in something considerably more permanent, when the accused was a pirate. That theater reached heights of drama and political significance that few other crimes could match. And when the accused was a privateer, well, that was a different kind of theater altogether. Quieter, more procedural, more like accounting than spectacle, which tells you, perhaps, more about the difference between these two figures than any amount of description could. Let us begin, as the law itself preferred to begin, with jurisdiction. The question of who had the right to judge crimes committed on the open ocean was not a simple one in the age of sail. The ocean belonged to no nation. A crime committed 300 miles from the nearest coastline did not fall neatly within the borders of any kingdom's legal authority. And yet crimes were committed out there, constantly, in staggering variety and volume, and someone had to deal with them. The solution that emerged over centuries of maritime practice was the Admiralty court system. Admiralty courts were specialized tribunals with authority over matters relating to the sea, shipping disputes, maritime contracts, salvage claims, and, crucially, crimes committed on the water. They existed in every major seafaring nation, and they operated according to a body of law that was simultaneously more international and more brutal than the courts that handled crimes committed on land. A privateer who captured a prize brought that prize before an admiralty court for adjudication. This was not optional. It was a legal requirement embedded in the terms of his letter of marque. The court would examine the captured vessel, assess its cargo, review the privateer's commission, and determine whether the seizure had been lawful. If the court ruled in the privateer's favor, if it determined that the target had indeed been an enemy vessel, that the privateer had operated within the boundaries of his commission, that no rules of engagement had been violated, then the prize was condemned and the proceeds distributed. The privateer received his share. The government received its share. The bond posted at the commission's outset remained intact. If the court ruled against him, if it determined that the privateer had exceeded his commission, attacked a neutral vessel, or otherwise behaved in ways that his letter did not authorize, the consequences range from financial penalty to the revocation of his commission to criminal prosecution, depending on the severity of the violation. It was, in essence, an accountability mechanism. Imperfect, certainly. Subject to corruption and political influence, absolutely. But a mechanism nonetheless. The privateer operated within a system that could evaluate his conduct, reward his compliance, and punish his transgressions. The pirate operated outside every system entirely, and the law's response to that was correspondingly absolute. In 1536, an Act of Parliament in England made piracy triable without a jury, before commissioners of Oyer and Terminer, a legal phrase meaning, roughly, to hear and determine who could convene anywhere, including in the colonies, without requiring that the accused be transported back to England for trial. This was a significant development. It meant that the apparatus for trying and executing pirates could be assembled quickly, locally, and with minimal procedural friction. By the early 18th century, at the height of what historians call the Golden Age of piracy, this framework had been refined further still. The Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, passed in 1700, empowered colonial governors to convene admiralty courts that could try pirates on the spot in whatever port or colony was nearest, with commissioners drawn from naval officers, colonial officials, and other respectable local figures. The result was a legal process that was, by any modern standard, extraordinarily swift. Capture, trial, verdict, execution. The entire sequence could unfold within days, sometimes within hours, in cases where the evidence was particularly clear and the presiding officials particularly motivated. This speed was not accidental. It was policy. The suppression of piracy was, by the early 1700s, an urgent priority for every major maritime power, and urgency has never been especially patient with procedural delay. The law wanted pirates dead. It wanted them dead visibly, publicly, and in sufficient numbers to communicate to any sailor considering a similar career that the mathematics of the choice were not in his favor. The trial of a pirate, when it did proceed with some semblance of deliberation, was a remarkable thing to witness. Consider the trial of the crew of Bartholomew Roberts, conducted at Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast of Africa in 1722. Roberts himself had been killed in battle shortly before, which robbed the proceedings of their most dramatic potential defendant, but the trial that followed was nonetheless one of the largest piracy trials in history. Over 160 men were tried. The proceedings lasted weeks. Witnesses were called. Defenses were offered. Some accused men argued that they had been forced into piracy against their will, a defense that carried genuine legal weight, since the courts recognized a distinction between voluntary pirates and men who had been coerced into joining a crew after their own vessel was captured. That distinction between the willing pirate and the pressed man was one of the few places where the legal treatment of piracy showed something resembling mercy. Men who could credibly demonstrate coercion, who had witnesses to testify on their behalf, who had made visible attempts to escape or resist, stood a real chance of acquittal. And at the Roberts trial, a meaningful number of men were indeed acquitted or convicted of lesser charges on precisely these grounds. The rest were hanged. 52 men, executed in batches, their bodies afterward treated according to a practice that had become standard procedure in the suppression of piracy. The corpses of the most notorious offenders were displayed in iron cages called gibbets, suspended from posts along the coastline, visible to every passing ship. It was a message written in the most permanent ink available. The most famous such display in history remains that of William Kidd, whose body hung in a gibbet over the Thames at Tilbury Point for 3 years following his execution in 1701. 3 years. Long enough for the iron to rust. Long enough for every sailor entering or leaving London to understand, without any accompanying text or explanation, exactly what the Crown thought of men who went beyond their commissions. And here, in the story of William Kidd, the distinction between privateer and pirate reveals its most uncomfortable truth. Kidd had begun his career with a letter of marque. He was a commissioned privateer, authorized to pursue pirates and enemy French vessels in the Indian Ocean. He was, at the outset of his final voyage, a legitimate man operating within a legitimate framework. What happened next is still debated by historians. Some argue that Kidd turned pirate deliberately, seduced by opportunity, and unconstrained by the conscience that had previously governed his conduct. Others argue that he was the victim of circumstance, that the vessels he attacked had papers that were ambiguous at best, that the political winds in London shifted against him while he was at sea, and that he returned to port, expecting to defend his actions before an admiralty court, only to find that the men who had backed his commission had decided it was safer to sacrifice him than to stand beside him. What is not debated is what happened to him. He was tried, he was convicted, he was hanged, and then he was put in a gibbet and left to rust over the Thames. The letter of marque that had once defined him as a lawful man could not save him. The court that had once been his accountability mechanism became instead the instrument of his destruction. This is what the legal distinction between privateers and pirates ultimately reveals when you look at it long enough and honestly enough. The privateer existed within the law, yes. He was protected by it, regulated by it, and rewarded by it. But that protection was always conditional. It depended on the continued goodwill of the government that had issued his commission. It depended on political circumstances that could change while he was months away at sea with no way of knowing. It depended on admiralty judges who were themselves subject to the pressures of governments that sometimes needed a convenient villain more than they needed a complicated truth. The pirate had none of that protection, but he also had none of that vulnerability. He had made his choice openly, defiantly, with full knowledge of its consequences. And there is something, not romantic exactly, because the gallows and the gibbet were not romantic places, but something clarifying about that, about a man who looked at the conditional safety of the legal framework and decided that the conditions were not ones he was willing to accept. The court would judge them both, but only one of them had ever trusted it. Strip away the flags, the legal documents, the courtrooms, and the gallows, and you arrive eventually at the question that was, for most of the men involved, the most pressing one of all. What was in it for them? It is a question that history sometimes treats as beneath serious consideration, as though the great events of the past were driven entirely by ideology and honor, and the clash of civilizations, with no particular reference to the rather more immediate matter of whether a man could afford to eat. But the sailors of the golden age of sail were not abstractions. They were human beings with debts and families and the persistent, undignified problem of needing to survive, and the economics of life at sea. Who paid whom? How much? Under what conditions? With what guarantees? Shaped the world of privateers and pirates as decisively as any law or any flag. The financial structures of privateering and piracy were not merely different. In some ways, they were mirror images of each other, and examining them side by side tells you something important, not only about these two particular ways of life, but about the broader question of what men will do when the legitimate economy fails to make them a reasonable offer. Begin with the privateer, and begin with a number that tends to surprise people when they encounter it for the first time. Privateering was not, for most of the men who crewed privateer vessels, enormously lucrative. This requires some unpacking, because the image of the privateer that has come down to us through history tends to focus on the spectacular successes, the treasure galleons taken, the merchant fleets disrupted, the fortunes made in a single voyage by captains who returned to port as wealthy men. And those successes were real. Francis Drake's raid on the Spanish port of Cadiz in 1587, his circumnavigation funded in part by privateering proceeds, his capture of the Spanish treasure ship Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. These were genuinely transformative windfalls, the kind of prizes that passed into legend because they were so far outside the ordinary experience of maritime commerce. But they were not ordinary. They were extraordinary by definition, and the men who crewed the vessels that pursued them shared in the proceeds according to a hierarchy that was thoroughly, deliberately, and sometimes brutally unequal. The privateer captain received the largest share, always. His investors, the merchants, nobles, and occasionally government officials who had put up the capital to outfit the voyage, received their portions next. The Admiralty, depending on the nation and the era, took its cut. What remained after these prior claims had been satisfied was divided among the crew according to rank, with officers receiving multiples of what common sailors received, and common sailors receiving amounts that were, in the context of the risks they had accepted and the hardships they had endured, frequently modest. A successful voyage could still produce meaningful earnings for ordinary crew members. But a voyage that failed to take prizes, and many did, produced nothing at all beyond the base wages that some privateering contracts included, and many did not. The common privateer sailor was, in the most direct economic sense, a speculator. He was betting his labor, his safety, and, quite possibly, his life, on the hope that the captain whose vessel he had signed onto would prove skilled enough, lucky enough, and well connected enough to bring home prizes worth dividing. Sometimes that bet paid, often it did not. The pirate ship operated according to an entirely different logic. And here, the contrast is sharp enough to be genuinely startling. Pirate crews, far from being the anarchic, every man for himself rabble that popular imagination tends to conjure, were governed by remarkably sophisticated internal economies. Most pirate vessels operated under written articles, shipboard constitutions, essentially, that specified in precise detail how the proceeds of any capture would be divided among the crew. These articles were drafted collectively, agreed to by all hands before a voyage began, and enforced by the crew itself. The division they prescribed was, by the standards of the era, almost shockingly equitable. On most pirate vessels, the captain received a share that was larger than other crew members, typically between 1.5 and 2 shares, depending on the articles, but not dramatically so. The quartermaster, who handled the practical administration of the ship and served as a check on the captain's authority, received a similar premium. Skilled specialists, the carpenter, the surgeon, the gunner, might receive modest additional compensation reflecting the value of their expertise. But the ordinary sailor, the man before the mast, with no particular rank or title, received a full share, not a fraction of a share. not a portion calculated to reflect his position at the bottom of a hierarchy. A full share, equivalent in most respects to what any other member of the crew received. This was not idealism, it was practical governance. A pirate crew that felt cheated by its distribution of prizes was a pirate crew that would depose its captain, which happened with some regularity, or dissolve entirely, which happened with even greater regularity. The equitable share structure was the mechanism by which pirate captains purchased the loyalty of men who were, by definition, not subject to the military discipline that kept naval crews in line. You could not flog a pirate into compliance in the way you could a sailor in the Royal Navy. You had to make it worth his while to stay. And the articles went further than mere share distribution. They included compensation for injuries, a sliding scale that specified what a crew member would receive for the loss of a right arm versus a left arm, an eye, a finger, a leg. This was insurance, written into the ship's founding document, at a time when insurance as a concept was barely a generation old in the broader commercial world. A pirate who lost his right hand in action could expect to receive, depending on the specific articles of his vessel, somewhere between 500 and 600 pieces of eight in compensation. Not a fortune, but something. A recognition that his sacrifice had value, and that the crew he had fought alongside acknowledged that value in writing. The economic comparison, laid out plainly, produces a discomfort that it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The privateer system, for all its legal respectability, delivered its rewards through a hierarchy that concentrated wealth at the top and distributed relatively modest returns to the men whose bodies and lives constituted the actual risk. The pirate system, for all its criminality, distributed its rewards with a rough democratic equity that most legitimate maritime employment of the era could not begin to approach. This was not lost on the sailors of the time, not at all. Recruiting was a persistent challenge for privateer captains, and the Navy's methods of addressing that challenge. Impressment, the legal kidnapping of men off the streets of port towns and forced into service, tells you something important about how attractive legitimate maritime employment actually was. Men did not, as a rule, line up eagerly for the opportunity to risk their lives in exchange for a small, fractional share of uncertain prizes under the authority of a captain whose first obligation was to his investors rather than his crew. Pirate crews, by contrast, were rarely short of volunteers in the Golden Age. Men came to piracy from naval service, from privateering, from merchant ships where conditions were brutal and pay was poor. They came because the articles offered them something they had not encountered elsewhere, a direct, written, enforceable stake in the outcome of their own labor. There is a word that historians sometimes apply to the internal governance of pirate ships, and it is a word that tends to make people stop and reconsider their assumptions. That word is democratic. Not democratic in the full modern sense. Pirate crews were not paragons of equality, and the brutality of pirate life was very real. But in the specific context of the 18th century, when most men had no vote in anything that affected them, when the hierarchy of class determined the distribution of almost every resource, when the labor of ordinary men reliably enriched the men above them without meaningful recourse. In that context, the articles of a pirate ship represented something genuinely unusual, a contract, negotiated, agreed upon, binding on everyone, including the captain. The privateer served as sovereign and his investors. The pirate, in the most precise economic sense, served the articles. And the articles, whatever else might be said about the men who wrote them and lived by them, served the crew. Loyalty is one of those words that sounds simple until you press on it. We use it casually, as though its meaning is self-evident, as though everyone who hears it understands the same thing by it. But loyalty is not simple. It is not a single thing. It is a layered, complicated, and deeply political concept that has meant different things to different people in different eras. And the question of what a man owed to his king, to his nation, to his crew, to himself, was one of the defining moral questions of the Age of Sail. The privateer and the pirate answered that question in ways that could not have been more different, and the world around them responded to those answers in ways that reveal, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what the governments and merchant classes of the era feared most. The privateer's loyalty was, at least in its formal structure, uncomplicated. He served the crown, or, more precisely, he served the interests of the crown as expressed through the letter of marque that defined his commission and the admiralty court system that oversaw his conduct. His national identity was not incidental to his work. It was the legal foundation of it. Without his allegiance to a particular sovereign, his commission was meaningless. Without his commission, his actions at sea were criminal. The privateer's loyalty and the privateer's livelihood were, in the most literal sense, the same thing. This created a relationship between the privateer and his nation that was simultaneously intimate and transactional. He was not a patriot in the uncomplicated, purely ideological sense. He was a contractor, a man who had entered into a specific agreement with a specific government, an agreement that granted him considerable freedom of action in exchange for his operating within certain defined parameters and, crucially, in the service of certain defined national interests. When those interests aligned with his own, when the enemy his commission authorized him to pursue was also an enemy he had personal reasons to dislike, when the prizes his commission entitled him to take were sufficiently lucrative to justify the risks, the arrangement worked smoothly. The privateer was, in those circumstances, a contented servant of empire. His loyalty cost him little because the relationship rewarded him well. But when the interests diverged, when his commission authorized targets that were not particularly profitable, when political shifts at home altered the terms of engagement while he was months away at sea with no way of knowing, when the government that had issued his letter decided that the diplomatic calculus had changed and that his continued operations were now inconvenient, the contractual nature of his loyalty became suddenly uncomfortably visible. Captain Kidd, whom we have already met in these pages, understood this better than most. His loyalty to the crown had been, as far as he was able to demonstrate, genuine. His commission had been issued by legitimate authority. His actions at sea, whatever their legal ambiguities, had been conducted with at least the intention of serving the interests he had been commissioned to serve. None of it was sufficient when the political winds shifted. His loyalty was real. The crown's reciprocal loyalty to him was not. This was the privateer's essential vulnerability. His allegiance made him legible to the state, visible, trackable, accountable, in ways that the pirate, by deliberate choice, was not. The pirate's relationship to loyalty was a rejection so thorough and so explicit that it functioned almost as a philosophy. When men turned pirate in the Golden Age, they frequently marked the transition with a specific ritual. They declared, in the language of the era, that they were going on the account, an old mercantile phrase that here carried the weight of a declaration of independence. They renounced their national allegiance. They placed themselves outside the protection and the obligation of the nations that had produced them. They declared themselves, in the words of one famous pirate proclamation that historians have debated and partly reconstructed, citizens of the sea rather than of any particular land, hostis humani generis. We have encountered that phrase before, enemy of all mankind. It was the legal designation applied to pirates, and it is worth understanding why the law chose those words specifically. Not enemy of England, not enemy of Spain or France or Portugal, enemy of all mankind. The designation was not merely punitive, it was analytical. It recognized that the pirate's rejection of national loyalty placed him in a category that transcended ordinary international conflict. You could make peace with an enemy nation. You could negotiate, sign treaties, exchange prisoners. You could not make peace with someone who had rejected the very framework within which peace was made and kept. The pirate, by refusing to belong to any nation, had made himself an enemy of the system itself. And the system, for understandable reasons, took that personally. What is remarkable, when you study the composition of pirate crews in any detail, is how genuinely international they tended to be. This was not accidental. It was, in part, a direct consequence of the rejection of national loyalty. A pirate ship had no reason to discriminate along national lines, because national lines were precisely what it had abandoned. English sailors served alongside Dutch ones, French alongside Portuguese. On some vessels, significant numbers of African sailors, some free, some who had escaped enslavement, some captured from slave ships and offered the choice of joining the crew, served as full members with full shares under the Articles. The pirate ship was, in the context of the 18th century, a peculiarly cosmopolitan institution, not a utopia. The violence and brutality of pirate life were very real, and the position of African crew members varied considerably from vessel to vessel and captain to captain. But an institution that was, structurally, organized around shared interest rather than shared nationality, in an era when shared nationality was the dominant organizing principle of almost every other collective human endeavor. Bartholomew Roberts flew a flag that depicted him standing on two skulls labeled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, representing his contempt for the governors of those colonies who had made his life difficult. The flag was not merely a personal statement of grievance. It was a declaration of war against the very concept of colonial authority, against the idea that men with titles and commissions had the right to determine the terms of existence for men without them. This was why the pirates' rejection of loyalty was considered so dangerous. Not because piracy disrupted trade, though it did enormously. Not because pirate violence was cruel, though it could be, but because the idea at the center of it, that a man might simply refuse the terms offered by the nation of his birth and construct an alternative set of arrangements more to his liking, was a contagious one. It was an idea that could spread, an idea that every dissatisfied sailor on every underpaid, brutal merchant vessel might hear and find, in the privacy of his own thinking, difficult to argue against. The governments of the age understood this. Their response to piracy was not merely law enforcement, it was ideological suppression. The gibbet over the Thames was not primarily a punishment, it was a counter-argument, a rebuttal, written in the most persuasive language available, to the idea that a man could simply choose to walk away from what he owed. The privateer's loyalty, then, was the thing that made him useful, and the thing that made him vulnerable. It connected him to the power of the state, and exposed him to the state's capacity for betrayal in equal measure. The pirate's rejection of loyalty was the thing that made him free and the thing that made him hunted. It severed him from every protection that national belonging provided and left him with nothing to stand on but the Articles, the crew, and the increasingly slim odds that the sea would prove more forgiving than the men who sailed it in the name of order. Neither arrangement was safe. Neither was without its costs. But they were, in the most fundamental sense, opposite bets on the same question. Could a man trust the nation that claimed him? The privateer said yes, provisionally, and signed the commission. The pirate said no, absolutely, and threw the commission into the sea. History, in its unhurried way, recorded what happened to both of them. The ocean is not a featureless void. It is easy, looking at a map, to see it that way, as the empty blue spaces between the places that matter, the negative space around the continents and islands where history actually happens. But sailors have always known better. They have always understood that the ocean has its own geography, its own structure, its own corridors and choke points and crossroads, its own places where the wind behaves in predictable ways and the currents run strong, and the shipping lanes converge into narrow passages that every vessel must navigate, whether it wishes to or not. And wherever shipping lanes converged, wherever the geography of wind and current and commerce funneled valuable cargo into predictable paths, the men who preyed upon that commerce were never far behind. The geography of privateering and piracy was not random. It was not opportunistic in the casual sense of the word. It was a precise, calculated response to the geography of empire, to the routes along which wealth moved, the ports where it accumulated, the stretches of ocean where the reach of naval authority grew thin, and the risks of interception grew correspondingly lower. Understanding where these men sailed tells you almost everything about why they sailed there, and why the world they moved through looked so different from the world of the merchants and naval officers who pursued them. Begin in the Caribbean. It is impossible when discussing either privateering or piracy to begin anywhere else. The Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries was the most consequential body of water on Earth, and it was consequential for one reason above all others: silver. The mines of Potosí in present-day Bolivia, the richest silver deposit ever discovered, were producing quantities of precious metal so vast that they were reshaping the global economy in real time. That silver moved by mule train to the Pacific coast of South America, by ship up to Panama, across the isthmus by land, and then aboard the great Spanish treasure fleets, the floaters, through the Caribbean and across the Atlantic to Seville. The route was not secret. It could not be secret. The sheer volume of material moving along it made concealment impossible. Every maritime power in Europe knew where the Spanish treasure fleets sailed, approximately when they sailed, and approximately what they carried. The Caribbean was, in this sense, an open invitation, written in silver and geography, to every privateer captain with a fast ship and a letter of marque. English privateers understood this with particular clarity. The islands of the Caribbean were scattered across the treasure route like stepping stones, and England, France, and the Netherlands all established colonial footholds there with strategic purposes that went well beyond agriculture. Port Royal in Jamaica became, by the mid-17th century, the most important privateering base in the Western Hemisphere. A city built substantially on the proceeds of commissions authorized by the English crown against Spanish shipping. A city whose wealth and violence and barely contained chaos made it one of the most extraordinary places in the world, until an earthquake consumed most of it in 1692. The privateer in Caribbean waters was, in most cases, operating close enough to sympathetic colonial authorities that the practical support structures of his enterprise, the ability to refit, resupply, sell prizes, recruit crew, and obtain new commissions if his old ones expired, were never more than a few days' sail away. The geography worked for him in the most immediate, logistical sense. The pirates' geography overlapped with the privateers, but extended further, into waters where colonial authority was thinner still, and the distances between any form of institutional oversight grew vast enough to be functionally irrelevant. The Bahamas in the early 18th century were, for a period of roughly a decade, the closest thing the golden age of piracy had to a headquarters. Nassau, the principal settlement on New Providence Island, had been largely abandoned by its colonial administration following a series of Spanish and French attacks, and into that administrative vacuum poured an extraordinary concentration of pirate captains, crews, and support infrastructure. At its peak, Nassau harbored a pirate population that some estimates place at over 1,000 men, a significant fraction of the entire active pirate workforce of the Atlantic world, gathered in a single location because the location offered exactly what pirates needed: proximity to the major shipping lanes, distance from effective naval authority, a harbor deep enough for large vessels, fresh water, and, critically, a population of merchants and tavern keepers and suppliers who were willing, for the right price, to ask no questions about where the money they were being offered had come from. Nassau was, in the most precise sense, a pirate republic. not governed by any formal pirate political system. The reality was considerably more chaotic than that phrase implies, but a place where the normal structures of colonial authority had collapsed sufficiently that something else had filled the space. The pirates did not govern Nassau so much as they occupied it, the way a gas fills a vacuum, spreading into every corner that authority had vacated. It lasted until 1718, when Woodes Rogers arrived as the newly appointed royal governor with a naval escort, a royal pardon for any pirate willing to accept it, and a very clear message for those who declined. Within a year, the Republic was over. The men who had taken the pardon were attempting, with varying degrees of sincerity and success, to reintegrate themselves into legitimate society. The men who had declined were being hunted. Further east, the Indian Ocean offered its own version of this geography, and it attracted both privateers and pirates for reasons that were, again, rooted in the flow of commerce. The Mughal Empire's merchant fleet, the trading networks of the Arabian Sea, the routes connecting the subcontinent to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the East African coast. These carried wealth of a different character than the silver of the Spanish Main, but wealth of comparable volume and comparable vulnerability. The English East India Company's trading posts at Surat and Bombay depended on the security of these routes, and when that security was threatened, the consequences were felt not merely by individual merchants, but by the entire political relationship between England and the Mughal court. William Kidd's final, fatal voyage took him into these waters. So did the operations of Henry Every, whose capture of the Mughal treasure ship Ganges Sawai in 1695 was one of the most valuable single prizes in the history of maritime predation, and also one of the most diplomatically catastrophic, triggering a Mughal response that threatened to end English trading rights in India entirely. The Indian Ocean was not merely a geography of opportunity, it was a geography of consequences, where the actions of individual ships could ripple outward into international politics in ways that Caribbean operations, for all their drama, rarely matched. There were other theaters. The waters off the West African coast, where slave ships and trading vessels created a concentration of targets that attracted pirates during the peak years of the trade. The Mediterranean, where the ancient practice of corsairing, a form of state-sanctioned privateering with roots stretching back to the Crusades, continued to operate under the authority of the Barbary states well into the 19th century, blurring the line between privateer and pirate in ways that European maritime law found consistently difficult to manage. And always, in every theater, the same underlying geography applied. The prizes moved along predictable routes determined by wind and current and commerce. The predators, privateer and pirate alike, positioned themselves along those routes in the places where the flow of ships was richest and the reach of authority was thinnest. The map of Golden Age piracy and privateering is, when you look at it correctly, not a map of lawlessness. It is a map of the global economy, with the roots of wealth marked out by the men who preyed upon it. Geography did not determine fate, but it shaped the terms on which fate arrived. A privateer operating in Caribbean waters with a colonial port 2 days' sail behind him and a valid commission in his strongbox faced a different set of possibilities than a pirate 3 months into the Indian Ocean, with no safe harbor within 1,000 miles, and every naval power on Earth theoretically authorized to hang him on sight. The ocean was the same water beneath both their keels, but it was not, in any meaningful sense, the same ocean. History is not a record, not really. It is a selection, a series of choices made by people with their own interests and blind spots and agendas, about which stories are worth preserving and which can be allowed to fade, about which figures deserve monuments and which deserve gibbets, about where to draw the line between the hero and the criminal, the patriot and the outlaw, the man worth remembering and the man worth forgetting. The privateer and the pirate have both survived into the present, but they have survived differently. They have been shaped by different hands, filtered through different lenses, and arrived at the 21st century wearing costumes that their original wearers would find, in many respects, entirely unrecognizable. Understanding how that happened, how these two figures were transformed by centuries of retelling into the versions we now carry around in our heads, is, in some ways, the most revealing part of this entire story. The privateer's transformation began almost immediately, and it followed a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who has watched the relationship between governments and their useful servants play out over time. The most successful privateers were absorbed into respectability, with a thoroughness that erased, or at least softened, the more uncomfortable aspects of what they had actually done. Francis Drake, who had spent years raiding Spanish shipping with a ferocity that the Spanish court considered straightforwardly criminal, was knighted by Queen Elizabeth on the deck of his own ship upon completing his circumnavigation of the globe. The knighthood did not change what Drake had done. It changed what it meant. It retroactively reframed years of maritime violence as patriotic service, transforming a man whose methods were indistinguishable from piracy into a national hero whose portrait would eventually hang in the halls of power. This was the privateer's ultimate fate, when things went well. Not merely legal tolerance during his active career, but retrospective celebration once his career was safely concluded, and his usefulness to the historical narrative of national greatness could be established. The letter of marque, which had always been a transactional document, became in retrospect a certificate of heroism. The prizes he had taken became evidence of English courage and Spanish arrogance. The violence was absorbed into the story of empire and emerged on the other side as glory. When things went less well, when the political winds had shifted, when the government had found it convenient to disavow him, when the gibbet had done its work, the privateer simply disappeared from the official record, not vilified particularly, just gone, surplus to the requirements of the national story being told. The pirate's transformation followed a stranger and more circuitous path, and it produced something that no one in the 18th century could possibly have anticipated. It produced romance. The process began in the pirates' own lifetimes, in the broadsides and pamphlets that circulated through the port towns of the Atlantic world during the Golden Age, carrying accounts of pirate captures and trials and executions that were consumed by the reading public with an appetite that their authors found both lucrative and slightly alarming. These accounts were not sympathetic exactly. They were produced within a framework that condemned piracy absolutely and celebrated its suppression enthusiastically. But they were detailed, they were vivid. They gave names and faces and biographical particulars to men who had done extraordinary things in extraordinary places. And the human mind, presented with that kind of material, does not always respond with the moral clarity that the authors intended. Captain Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in 1724, was the document that crystallized this transformation. Johnson, whose true identity remains disputed by historians to this day, wrote about pirates with a biographical intimacy and a narrative energy that made his subjects impossible to dismiss. Blackbeard emerged from Johnson's pages, not as an abstraction of criminal menace, but as a specific, peculiar, almost theatrical human being, a man who wove slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle, so that he entered combat wreathed in smoke, who cultivated his own legend with something approaching artistic dedication. Bartholomew Roberts appeared as a man of paradoxical personal discipline, teetotal in an era of rampant shipboard drinking, formal in his dress, rigorous in his enforcement of the articles, whose career of extraordinary success made him impossible to reduce to a simple cautionary tale. Johnson gave the pirates interiority, and interiority once given cannot be taken back. From Johnson it was a relatively short distance. Through the Gothic novels of the late 18th century, through the romantic poetry of Byron, through the operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan with their lovable, bumbling pirates of Penzance, to the fully realized romantic mythology that the 19th century handed to the 20th, and the 20th century, equipped with cinema, did things with that mythology that no previous era could have imagined. The pirates that arrived on screen bore almost no resemblance to the men Johnson had written about. The violence was softened or aestheticized. The economics were ignored entirely. The democratic articles, the genuine political radicalism, the desperate and frequently brutal reality of life on a pirate vessel. All of it was replaced with something cleaner, more colorful, more useful for the purposes of entertainment. What remained was the flag, the accent, the swashbuckling freedom, the romantic rejection of convention. The skull and crossbones became a symbol not of terror but of transgression. And transgression, in the vocabulary of popular culture, is a quality that tends to attract rather than repel. There is something worth sitting with in the distance between what these men actually were and what we have made of them. The privateer was, in reality, often the more consequential figure, more deeply embedded in the political and economic machinery of empire, more directly responsible for the outcomes of wars, more thoroughly integrated into the systems of power that shaped the world. And yet he has faded, relatively speaking, from popular imagination. He is a footnote, a technicality, a distinction that has to be explained before it can be appreciated. The pirate was, in reality, a figure of genuine desperation, as often as genuine defiance. A man whose choices were frequently constrained by circumstances that the romance entirely omits. And yet he has expanded, in the cultural imagination, into something almost mythological, a symbol of freedom so thoroughly polished by 2 centuries of storytelling that the original, complicated, dangerous human being is barely visible beneath the shine. What does that tell us? Perhaps it tells us that we have always been more comfortable with the outlaw than with the contractor. That the man who burns his bridges makes a better story than the man who negotiates their terms. That freedom, even dangerous and doomed freedom, speaks to something in us that legality and commission and admiralty courts simply cannot reach. Or perhaps it tells us something simpler, that the stories we tell about the past are always, in the end, stories about ourselves, about what we wish we were brave enough to choose, about the letters of marque we accept and the ones we throw into the sea. The ocean keeps its own counsel on the matter. It was there before the privateers and the pirates sailed it. It will be there long after the last story about them has been told. And out on the water, in that particular silence just before dawn, it remains exactly what it has always been. Indifferent, vast, and deeply, quietly free.